Last Gasp, a tale of sacrifice. The air filled with the sound of screeching brakes and shattering glass. I could hear the metal crumpling around me as my car hit the ground with a thud. There was a second where time slowed as the headlights got closer before everything went black. Then all around me was silence. Not the type of silence that needs to be filled to avoid the inevitable discomfort of those within it. No, this silence was welcoming, like a hug from your mother after you'd fallen and scraped your knee. Colours swirled and filled my vision with a kaleidoscope of shades and hues crashed against me as the silence that had been the single source of comfort was replaced by a landscape of panic and carnage. Sounds of sirens filled the air, mingled with the voices of people shouting commands. The mechanical whir of something caught my attention, and then a screeching whine of metal being torn created a need to cover my ears. The place I was before seemed so far from where I was now. Here, chaos had erupted. A crash had sent shards of glass and plastic that had been from the vehicles involved in a spray across the road. People had stopped their own cars and were rushing towards the three cars, now crushed together into something that once could have distinguished three separate vehicles. Firefighters surrounded the mesh of vehicles with large hydraulic scissors, which I now saw as the source of the sound I had shielded my ears from seconds ago. As I searched the twisted metal for signs of life, I walked towards the accident. I could help those attempting to pull the doors open, perhaps, I thought. I am strong after all. After a few steps, I noticed three of the firefighters pulled at something inside the third car, while a woman behind frantically waved her arms towards other emergency services to bring more urgency to the scene. Beside me, a man placed his hand on my shoulder. "There's nothing you can do to help now," he said. My head spun towards him as I challenged his statement. "Surely there is. I could help free those still trapped," I argued, looking down at my large hands. In my youth, I had been a rugby player, known for my strength during my playing days. "I'm strong," I persisted. "You were. That is true. But this is not something your strength can help with anymore." I looked back and saw a shape being dragged from the wreckage. The firefighters had obviously freed someone and had pulled them away from the now smoking pile of cars. To the left, a man was pulling himself free from the first car in the conga line of ruined metal, and I felt warm relief at seeing his face emerge. "But there may be people still inside the cars. Surely we can help," I pleaded. My instincts told me I had to do something. Standing around watching people in need was not something I would do. I knew that. But other things in my head were still hazy. This I could focus on, and it would give me a sense of purpose in what was otherwise a scene of unexplained misery. "You believe you would be better than the emergency services currently freeing the occupants?" the man asked. "Your desire to help is admirable, but you cannot affect anything for those involved." I heard the words spoken and knew what the man was saying was true. But inside I knew there was something I could do that was more productive than watching. But I could also see the common sense in that I would likely hinder the rescue efforts. So I stayed where I was. A sizable crowd had gathered on the periphery of the accident, all with shocked faces at the carnage they now witnessed. I knew my face likely reflected theirs as I resigned myself to watch as the events unfolded. All activity now centered around the central vehicle. Its black tires twisted around the once circular alloys they covered were conspicuous only for the reason they weren't on the road like the other two cars' wheels. Clearly, this car had flipped during the crash. I took a step towards it and the crowd of helpers, who pulled and yanked at metal. Two women were crying into the chest of the man who had climbed out of the first car, and I wondered if they had been passengers. I looked back at the man waiting for me. He was a tall man, with a kind face that was smiling at me. 2 brown eyes, filled with compassion, gazed back from a bearded face of this man who seemed familiar. Suddenly, movement caught my eye, and I looked to see blonde hair atop the head of a woman being pulled out of the upturned car. Her eyes flickered for a second, before pain filled her beautiful face. "Do you know her?" I asked over my shoulder. "I do, but I am here for you, not her." His deep voice carried kindness in every word. I looked back at the woman being placed on a gurney by 2 paramedics. "When did they get you?" I asked, as the only emergency services I had witnessed to this point were the fire service. Now, flashing blue lights filled the darkening space around the collision, and police, ambulances and recovery vehicles had joined the fire trucks, and the scene now resembled a poorly lit disco, with red and blue flashing lights illuminated the sky in a poorly synchronized way that gave you a headache if you watched for too long. The woman turned her face, and I saw her blue eyes as they met mine. She held my gaze for a second, and in that moment I wanted to tell her how sorry I was that she had been involved in this accident. She only looked young, maybe early 30s, though with the blood around her head and scratches on her face it was difficult to be accurate. Police, I noted, spoke with people to my right, as firefighters held the large cutting machine against the middle car. "Do you think there's still someone trapped in there?" I asked. "Yes, there is one person left to extract from the wreckage," the kind man said. I looked back to the woman, who was now being loaded into the ambulance that waited on the opposite side of the crash from where I stood. She seemed to shout, reaching out her arms as though trying to grab hold of me. 2 paramedics placed their hands on her as they lifted the trolley into the back. I saw her saying something again, though I couldn't hear her. In fact, it suddenly dawned on me I could no longer hear anything of what was happening. The silence that had unexpectedly cocooned us only broken if I spoke, or my companion did. The scene was still busy, as people moved from place to place, with the police holding onlookers back and paramedics making the occupants of the other vehicles comfortable inside their ambulances. I scanned, trying to hear something, but there didn't appear to be anything to hear. I found the woman's eyes again, and found her still saying something. Her mouth moved, and suddenly I knew the words as though I had heard them 1,000,000 times before. "Please, don't leave me," she said, again and again, before the doors closed, and she was gone. "I think I know that woman," I said, as the ambulance pulled away. "I am sure she was talking to me just then, but—" I trailed off as 1,000 images collided in my mind. Her face laughing at a joke. The smell of her hair as I embraced her to provide comfort. "Do I know her?" I asked aloud, more to myself than anyone else in particular. "You do," came the unexpected reply. Confused, I looked back at the crash, in time to see the motionless body of a man lying beside the car. The unfolding events took my mind off the swirling imagery in my head, and temporarily stopped me trying to find the answer that felt so far away, yet painfully close. Paramedics had taken over from the firefighters and were pumping the chest of the man pulled from the wreckage, trying to revive him. Poor bloke, he must be something to do with the woman who has just left. "Do you think he'll survive?" I asked, as I looked back towards him. An unexpected sense of loss filled me as I watched the efforts to save this man. My chest seemed to feel each thrust of the paramedic's hands, and a new urgency I hadn't felt before took hold of me. "That is something he will need to decide for himself. There is an option to live, But it's not something that is forced on anyone. It is a chosen path. "Who are you?" I asked, as I looked up into the familiar face of the man. My heart raced as I felt an overwhelming sense of grief. The face of the woman taken away moments earlier returned to my mind, and with it the smell of a sweet perfume I recognized, and a desire to chase after the ambulance to ensure she was okay. "What is happening here?" "My name is Frederick, Stephen. I am here for you," he said as I frantically looked for the vehicle carrying the woman. "Stephen." I rolled the name around my mouth, trying to taste it. "I'm Stephen." This seemed to be a realization. I hadn't considered my name until then. With everything that was happening, I assumed I knew who I was. To discover I didn't was another blow to my already frantic mind. "You are, and I am Frederick, or Fred, if you prefer," Fred said. "Wait, what's going on?" I asked, as the situation felt more real. "You said I know that woman, and in my head I can see her name, but how I know her feels just out of reach." I looked back at the crash as police pushed back the gathered onlookers, all desperate to witness the death of the poor man from the accident. "Why can't I hear the sounds?" I pushed my fingers through my hair as I grasped for any meaning to what was happening. "All answers come with time, Stephen. Now you need to relax and let your mind adjust so that understanding can find you." "What is this mumbo-jumbo?" I asked. "Why do I feel you're not telling me something? How did I get you?" Questions bounced around my head, intermingled with images from a life I felt I should know, but was somehow disconnected from. "You need to acknowledge something before we can continue, Stephen," Fred said, as he again placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Without acceptance, we cannot move forward, and the answers you seek will remain out of reach." Again, I knew what Fred was telling me was correct, but my mind tried to find a reason for what was going on. I took another look around the crash site. People were huddling together, seemingly in comfort at the sight of the ongoing efforts to save the man from the car. Some were visibly upset, and many had hands covering their mouths, trying to hold words inside, or perhaps wails of fear and pity. His saviours continued trying to revive him, and I could feel the thump, thump, thump of the CPR process on the man's chest. I looked closer at his face and immediately knew who it was lying there. "That's me! I am dying!" I cried, as my mind suddenly filled with the life I had lived up to that point. "Her name is Sally, the woman in the ambulance. She is my wife. We were on our way home from a date night to the theatre." The words tumbled from my mouth. "Oh God! My kids!" More images of a family sitting around a table, enjoying board games. "I have 3 children!" "Well done, Stephen. Now we can decide on the path you wish to take," Fred said as the scene of the crash slowly disappeared, to be replaced by a landscape worthy of Monet's hand. The vivid colours of the leaf-filled trees hanging over a perfect lake, dotted with boats. The sun felt warm on my face as I looked up at the cloudless sky. All the panic created by the realization of my death and the life I had left faded, as a glowing warmth of contentment and safety took its place. "I'm dead, then," I said, as I took in the aromas of every summer I had ever known. "Not quite, but you need to decide if that's what you want," Fred said as he moved beside me. "This is just a temporary place you come to while you decide. The path ahead is entirely your choice." "So, I can go back?" I asked, though the thought of leaving this idyllic place seemed abhorrent to me. If that's what you want to do, yes, Fred replied. If this is temporary, where would I go if I decide not to go back? Heaven? My situation, which had moments before been confusing and chaotic, was now as clear as the lake I stood beside. I knew where I was, and knew what was to come next, but still needed to vocalize my questions as my soul clung to my humanity. Yes, I suppose heaven is the logical destination, though it is not the place you think it is. Fred walked along the lake shore, and I followed. The breeze lifted, and I watched as a lazy bee drifted with the wind towards a patch of vibrant flowers. Many don't get to see this place. For some, the moment of passing is so abrupt their consciousness never needs this transition. For others, they already decided in life, so there is no need to linger here, as they already know where they are going. Fred continued. People who are ill, you mean? I asked. Yes, that's right. Or those who have lived long enough that they have nothing left to experience. The elderly, as you know them, for example. Fred paused before reaching into the lake and removing a smooth white pebble. All comes back to where it began. That is the way it has always been, and will continue for as long as it needs to remain. He passed me the stone, and I rubbed my thumb across its smooth, flawless surface. It felt cold to my touch, yet seemed filled with energy. For some, this place is a dream. For others, it is a fixed point. He looked at the stone in my hand. But for all, it is a place of reflection and safety. The experiences you had can be overwhelming, and here you can be at peace while your consciousness reconciles itself. Fred smiled at me, and I instantly knew why his face was so familiar. We've met before, haven't we? I said, and was unsurprised to see Fred nod in acknowledgement. I remember you telling me we would meet when the time was right, and you would show me back to where it all began. The image of Fred, his kind face and comforting eyes, appeared in my mind, and before me the scene projected onto the lake, like a cinema for me to watch. I was small, only a baby, and you were seeing me off as I made my way towards a physical life? I asked, though I knew the answer. So here we are, the end, and you will now take me back. This was a statement of fact. Knowing this gave me a sense of peace as I slowly sat on the lake shore. I did say those things, and I would never lie to you, which is why I am here now, Fred began. When the time is right, I will show you the path. But I need to know that you recognize when that time is. It is not for me to tell you when to leave. It is for you to decide. He smiled as he sat next to me. So, are you ready? It was a simple question, and one which I was certain I knew the answer to. But as I opened my mouth to speak, an image of children appeared in my mind. Once again I saw my thought projected onto the lake for me to view. It was my 3 kids, Holly, Abigail, and Joseph, playing with each other in a field I knew was beside my house. Then an image of them crying, as they are told of the accident by their grandmother. My heart instantly broke. I can't leave them. They need me, I said, as the image disappeared. My wife needs me. I have more to do." Fred placed his arm around me and pulled me into him for a moment. "I knew you would make the right decision. Until we meet again." The pain was excruciating. I tried to scream, but couldn't get the air into my lungs as the pressure on my chest stopped me from inhaling. "He's back. Bloody hell, we have a pulse! I knew he was a fighter!" I heard a man say as the pressure on my chest released and I was able, finally, to suck in the oxygen I needed to cry out. "Sally!" I screamed. "Where is my wife?"